Greetings, this video will be both a brief overview as well as a full walkthrough of my new Excel checkbook for small business users. There will be different sections you can jump to, which will be outlined in the YouTube description below. If you happen to be a current user of my Excel checkbook for personal use, you'll recognize a lot of the features here, and many of you have been using that Excel checkbook for your small business. This version is better targeted for those of us with one or more small businesses. I'll start with a quick tour of the spreadsheet, and then we'll cover all of the major features in greater detail, which you can jump to via the links in the YouTube description. The first thing I'll point out is that there are 10 register worksheets. These register worksheets can be used for any sort of a bank account, a checking account, savings account, or credit card account. Each register worksheet has columns for the date, for the transaction type, for a check number if you're recording checks, the payee description, the withdrawal amount, deposit, balance is automatically calculated, a column for indicating that the transaction has been reconciled with your bank statement, and then we have a column called property/name. Now the idea behind this column is that perhaps you are using one checking account for more than one small business. So you can define a drop-down list for the different small businesses that you have. For example, maybe you are managing rental properties, maybe you have a pet care business, online tutoring business, etc. So as you make a transaction from that same checking account, you can designate which business that transaction was for. Next, there's a drop-down for category. This is also customizable, but we already have designated categories that are common for most small businesses. And as you pick a category from the list, for example, if I were to click on pet fees, that does automatically populate then the type column. And then lastly, there is a place for just an optional memo or additional note for any of the transactions. Now, just like in my personal version of the Excel checkbook, there is a worksheet for future transactions, for entering recurring transactions that you might have every month on the same day of the month. And with just a single click of a button, you can have those automatically post to the bottom of whichever checkbook register is appropriate. And we'll look at this feature in greater detail a little bit later on. Next, as you are working through your checkbook and you get your bank statement each month, if you'd like to reconcile that, there is a worksheet for doing reconciliation where you can put in your start date and end date of your bank statement, and the system will find how many checks, how many withdrawals, how many deposits are found within that date range, and you compare that against your bank statement. Okay, next there's a worksheet called Reports, which features an income and expense report divided by month and by year. For example, in this sample, we see income for rent collection, rent late fees, expenses for supplies, advertising, etc., broken down by the year, by the month, and with totals across the columns and rows. And this report screen does feature Excel slicer buttons for filtering. So for example, if I wanted to just focus on the year 2025 with a single click, I'm now seeing my income and expenses for just that particular year versus maybe looking at it for what I've entered in for 2024. And we'll take a great look at this feature a little bit later. Okay, next there's a worksheet called Dashboard, which will be a visual or graph representation of similar data. So we have graphs to indicate the amount of withdrawals and deposits and withdrawals per month, income by different categories, expenses by different categories, top 5 expenses, and again, all of these are also adjustable using filter buttons. Again, filter buttons by year or by month, by the particular bank account that you're working with, also filtering down on particular categories, as well as the ability to just hone in on the particular small business that you're working with. Yeah, so in this case, for example, maybe you're just focusing in on a particular rental property, or maybe the pet care business that you might have. Okay, next there's a P&L or profit and loss statement, similar to the expense and income report. This is just laid out a little bit differently to represent the income totals, expense totals, taxes, capital purchases, and again, it's all controllable with filtering buttons so that you can filter on a particular business, particular rental property, particular year, particular month, etc. Then there's a worksheet called Settings, which is where you can define the names of your rental properties or small businesses. So if here, for example, I've got to sample rental property names, online tutoring business, pet care business, personal. And if I were to put in a new business name, let's say that I start offering a delivery service, we can just type that in there. And then when we go to any of the register accounts, this will now be available as a drop-down choice. So that's a quick jet tour. Next, we'll dive into each feature individually. Before we take a look at entering sample transactions into one of the registers, let's take a visit to the settings worksheet and talk about a few things you would likely want to adjust. First of all, you'll probably want to rename these register worksheets to be more meaningful. So let's say, for example, this first one is for my primary checking account. So if I do a right click on that tab and choose rename, I can start typing in my new register name and then press enter. Maybe the second register will be a savings account, so I'll do a right click on that, choose rename, type in savings, press enter. So you get the idea. I'm going to go back to the settings tab, and you'll notice that here in this list of sheets, it automatically reflected those recent changes that I just made. And I have an option here of indicating whether or not a particular register is for an asset or liability. And so if you are using any of these register sheets, for example, for a credit card, you would want to designate that as a liability type of account. There is a table here for frequently used payees. So if you have transactions that you're repeatedly making to the same vendor, the same store, it can be handy just to put those in there. And we'll see where that comes into play here in just a moment when we enter in some sample transactions. Now you'll definitely want to visit this table for the property or biz name. So again, if you're doing rental properties, just come up with some kind of a short name to represent your different rental properties. Here I've got my samples of 120 Walnut Street, Apartment A, Apartment B. But maybe you have a different kind of a business. So again, I just recommend you put some kind of a short business name in there. It's probably also handy just to have at least one line in here designated as personal. The idea being that as you are making transactions from your primary checking account or bank account, sometimes you might be making personal expenditure. So it's just nice to have that as an option to help split out or designate those particular transactions. Okay, you also have a list for the categories. I definitely recommend that you review this list, make any changes. So you can just overwrite any of the entries that are in here. You can add new ones. You can also do this at the bottom of the list, just start adding in any additional entries that you might want. And you can quickly sort that list. It's kind of handy probably to have it sorted alphabetically. So as an example, if I just do a right click here in this first column, there's a sort option here to say sort A to Z, and it'll just help to keep that list alphabetized. Now, I do also recommend that the first entry be blank. It just kind of helps with a drop-down list so that it automatically shows at the top. So I'm just going to do have my cursor on that first row, and Excel features an insert button, so I'll just click on that insert button there to make sure that first row is blank. All right, after talking about the settings page here, let's go ahead and visit one of the registers and do some sample transactions. When you open a spreadsheet for the first time, there will be a few sample transactions in the first register, which you'll likely want to delete, although you may want to just play around with adding a few more samples just to get a feel for things before you officially get started. To clear out any sample transactions, just take your mouse and highlight from the second row over to the credit area, and then either hit your delete key on your keyboard, or you can also do a right click and choose the clear contents choice. You will want to enter in a starting balance, so deciding on what date that you're going to find the current balance of whatever bank account that you're referencing. Be sure to put in that starting balance and also the date for that starting balance. Now, I strongly recommend that this first date also be the oldest date in the list. That way you can, at any point, safely resort your spreadsheet by the oldest. Also, as part of clearing out any sample transactions, you can also highlight from the Reconcile through Property Name Category list and hit the delete key, being careful not to delete anything out of the type column and do not delete anything out of the balance column, as those are all formulas. All right, I'm going to return back now to my other spreadsheet where I do have a lot of sample transactions, and we'll go from there. All right, so I'm in the register called checking, and of course our first column is for date. You can either click the drop down and choose a recent date. So for example, maybe I'll pick /9. But do know that you can also just manually type in a date. So for example, if I type in 4/3/2025, or you can even shortcut it, just type in the last 2 digits. When you hit the enter key or arrow key, it will automatically default to the 4-digit year. Transaction type is totally optional. You do not have to fill that out, but there are drop-down choices here for like ATM, check, credit, debit, etc. Again, totally optional. All right, then there is a place for the check number. The spreadsheet here at the top will remind you what the last check number that it found in the register is, in this case 205. And if I were to put in, let's say 206, and then either use my arrow key or enter key, register does now know that the most recently used check number is 206. And now, by way of further example, well, let's say that I went to Amazon. Notice that it's popping up that name automatically because there is actually a drop-down list here. So this is the frequently used payees list that I mentioned in the settings worksheet that you can make use of if you want to. So for example, if I were to pick on Costco, notice that it actually populated in a default category of supplies, which of course I can override. But again, this frequently used payees list is handy for your payees that you're just making a lot of use of. Again, I'll go back and put in Amazon. And for my example, I'll indicate that I spent maybe $121.50. I'm going to use my right arrow key and come over here and now designate, well, which small business was this transaction for? And I've got my drop-down list here with my 2 rental properties, online tutoring business, pet care business, and so I can just indicate which one this was for. And then I've got my drop-down list again for categories, and here's where I want to make sure that I just pick the appropriate category. Default was supplies, and if that's good, I can just stick with that one. All right, now that is a quick look at just entering a sample transaction. Again, keep in mind that you can resort this list by date in case you maybe put in some entries out of date order and just would like to maintain it in date order. The little drop down button right here allows you to choose the sort oldest to newest choice. That option is also available from the ribbon bar. So for example, here toward the end of the ribbon bar, you've got the option for sort oldest to newest. Now, another common transaction that you might do on a semi-recurring basis is perhaps a withdrawal from your checking account and it gets deposited to the savings account. And you could certainly manually put in the date, a description, the amount you're withdrawing from the checking account, and then of course you would need to then visit the savings register and put in the corresponding entry for that, the same date, that it's a deposit from checking, what that amount was, etc. But I do want to mention that there is a feature here for transfer to and from account just to help streamline that process. So I'll go ahead and click on this button for transfer to from account. And on this screen is where you'll put in that same information, the date, description, amount, and then which register, which account I'm withdrawing from and depositing to. All right, so for my sample, I'm going to type in 4/10, hit the enter key or right arrow key. Description will be deposit to savings. Amount will be $150. And then here in the withdrawal from, it's a drop-down list, so I can indicate which register this is for. So it's coming out of my checking, and it's going to deposit to savings. I have an optional category field I can choose if desired. I'm going to leave that blank and just go ahead and click the button to post that entry. And now here in my checking register, I see that entry for the deposit to savings, withdrawal of $150. And if I go visit the savings register, I'll see that corresponding entry right here, which shows as a deposit of $150. All right, while we're talking about entering transactions, another frequent need might be to split out a transaction across either different categories or even across different businesses. And I should mention before diving into that feature that while most accountants or tax professionals would tend to recommend that you have a separate bank account for each small business. A lot of us might not be starting out that way. We might be starting with just one bank account that we're using for multiple small businesses. And this checkbook register has that flexibility so that you can have just one checking account that you're using for multiple small businesses. But perhaps down the road, you might actually get a separate checking account for your online tutoring business, a separate register and checking account for your pet care business. But in the meantime, we'll just stick with what we've got here. So let's take a look at this split a transaction feature. And I'll reference this transaction to Lowe's as an example. Let's say that I went to Lowe's and I needed to buy a variety of repair items or supply items that were for more than just one particular rental property or small business. And I like to split that out. So as long as my cursor is on that row somewhere, I can click on the Split a Transaction button. All right, so I arrive at this screen where I can now designate the split of this $312 amount across either different businesses and or different categories. So as an example, let's say that I did buy a few items that were for my first apartment, apartment A, and those are some different repair items, so we'll pick the repair category. I do have an optional memo field if you just want to make a mental note or reminder of what it was that I purchased. Perhaps it was a door lock, so I'll just indicate that. And let's say that the amount was $65. Now the sheet is letting me know that I still need to come up with the remaining $247 in categorization. And let's say that the another item was for my other apartment, apartment B, and I had to buy some supplies. So I'll just indicate that for my category. Again, I can put in an optional memo note, but I'm going to leave that blank and come over to the amount. And I'm going to estimate that the supplies amount was around $140, leaving me still $107.50 to specify. Okay, maybe that remainder was actually just for some personal things. So I'm going to go ahead and indicate personal. And maybe also for personal reasons, I also had some supplies that I bought for my home. So I'll indicate that. And then put in that remaining balance of $107.50. And now I can go ahead and tell it to post these entries. So I'll click on that post button. So I'm now returned to the checking register where I see that original entry for Lowe's and the 3 lines below there for split transaction that have those split amounts and then the designations that I chose for the different properties and categories. The original transaction has been modified for its description to indicate what the original split dollar amount was. And that's helpful when you're doing a bank statement reconciliation later in the month to be able to see that, you did have a transaction Lowe's on that date. The amount was $312, and then you can easily just indicate that particular transaction has now been reconciled. All right, now one more feature that you might find useful related to entering transactions into any of the register worksheets will be something called the future transactions, or you might refer to it as your recurring transactions. And there is a worksheet here at the bottom, but I do want to make a mention of another button that's available to you for list sheets. When you click that button, it pops up a little dialog there. Since this spreadsheet does have a lot of worksheets in it, it's just kind of handy to have a way to quickly pop up that list, and then you can do a double click or a single click and OK to arrive at a different register or different worksheet. So I'm going to double click on future transactions and now talk about this feature. So here's a place where you can list recurring, frequent, common transactions that you have every month. Let's say, for example, around the first of the month, you always have a rental property insurance payment to Allstate or some insurance company. So I'm putting in that, typically the first day of the month that happens. That's the description, that's the dollar amount. And I'd like it to go ahead and apply to a particular business name. In this case, a particular rental property. Let's fix that category. And again, maybe it's the insurance category. And the worksheet it should post to is the checking worksheet. Okay, maybe you've also got a cable TV bill, typically around the 5th day of the month. That's the typical amount. Again, I can designate a particular business name. And let's fix that worksheet because that should be coming out of the checking account. I've got this sample entry in here to indicate that this also works for deposit. So if you have a recurring common deposit amount, you can indicate that as well, what day of the month that usually happens, that yes, it is a deposit. And that deposit is typically happening into the checking account. Now, what are these other columns here? We got a group and a skip rows column. So the idea behind the group thing here is that when you do go to punch that button to post these, you'll see this little dialog pop up asking, well, which group? So the idea is that maybe you'd only like to post early in the month entries at one time and not post the later in the month entries. So that's why you can have these different group designations. And then the skip rows item here is that these entries are going to be posted to the bottom of whichever register we have indicated, but we'd like any blank rows to happen before these are posted. So that's just letting the system know, or letting the spreadsheet know how many blank rows to skip. I'm going to go ahead and click to post, and I'm going to tell it to post just the group A, so just be these first two entries. Okay, so now when I visit the checking, I'll notice that it did skip 5 blank rows, and then here are those recurring entries that have been posted here. And with these being future transactions, notice that the top of the register has a place to indicate what our balance is as of today's date, but based on the entries here in the future, the future balance is going to be a little bit less. All right, next we will move on to looking at the dashboard, reports, and profit and loss statement. We'll start with a look at the P&L, or the profit and loss statement. So here I have my sample displayed on the screen. And one thing I should mention right away is that anytime you visit either the P&L worksheet, the dashboard, or reports worksheet, there is a green button to refresh the data. And so that just ensures that you're looking at the most recent data, as this uses Excel Power Query to gather up all of the data from all of the different registers to display in one page. Now, this P&L statement lists the net profit at the top, but we've got sections here for the breakout of income, breakout of expenses, breakout of taxes, and these breakouts only appear if you've actually entered transactions and chosen those particular categories. And when you're looking at this screen, you can click the filter buttons on the side. For example, if I wanted to just focus on 2025, I can click that button, and now I'm only seeing the P&L for that particular year, versus for 2024. And then you've got buttons here to clear out any particular filter, and you can also do this by month. So if I pick the month of January, I see it for that versus the month of February, etc. And then this also works for filtering on your particular business. Again, if you've got multiple rental properties, multiple businesses, you can click on a particular small business and see the P&L for that particular business. Next, we'll take a look at the reports worksheet. And of course, if you see it down at the bottom, you can absolutely just click on that. There is the green button here for list sheets, which is just another way to navigate around. So we'll go to this reports worksheet, and there are some similarities to the P&L. It is an income and expense report. So we've got the breakdown of incomes, breakdown of expenses, but it is by month. So we see months for November, December of 2024 versus the months for 2025, just based on the sample data that I have put into this particular spreadsheet. And once again, you've got the slicer buttons to filter, so I could click on 2025, for example, and just focus on that year's entries. And anytime you click on these filter buttons, the other filter options will potentially update and might suddenly not show particular things. And it's all based on what data it's able to see. For example, 2025, I have sample data for these months, versus in 2024, I only have sample data for the months of November and December. And similar to the P&L, you've also got the slicer buttons to focus in on a particular business, for example, particular rental property or one of the other business entities. And this is something that you certainly could print out. So for example, if I go to Excel's print preview button, I'll see how that's going to print out here on a landscape orientation. And so for this particular report screen, again, you've got the other filter or slicer buttons to hone in on a particular category, or to only look at expenses versus income if desired. And all of these slicer buttons have a little button here in the corner to clear out any filter that you might have chosen. They also have a multi-select button so that if you wanted to see a couple particular things, let's say for example that for rental properties I would like to see just my 2 rental properties, we can click the multi-select, and then whatever is highlighted in blue is chosen. So I'll just uncheck or turn off these other ones, and now I strictly see the rental properties being reflected in the report. And again, I can just clear out that filter to see everything once again. So once you get used to these slicer buttons or filter buttons, the dashboard also is very similar. Of course, we've got the graphical charts to represent data. And again, you've got the slicer buttons to focus in on a particular year or a particular month, a particular bank account, particular categories. Again, with those options to clear out filters or to multi-select particular options. And here at the top of the dashboard is where you can do the selection of a particular property or business name. So again, if I click on just one particular rental property, I see the total withdrawals and deposits for both years. Of course, I could focus now on just maybe 2025 for that particular business or rental property, and see deposits and withdrawals also by month, income by category, top 5 expenses by category, top 15 expenses by category. All right, so that is a look at the reporting options of P&L reports and dashboard. Next, we'll move on to how to do bank statement reconciliation. Bank statement reconciliation can be particularly important if you have written checks that you're using from your checking account, because often it can take many days or longer before those get cleared. Now here in my sample checking account, I'm going to do a quick bank reconciliation for the month of January. So we have a button here at the top for Reconcile On Off, and when we click on that button, it opens up a few hidden rows to help us with the reconciliation process. First thing we're going to need to do is to tell the system or tell the spreadsheet what date range we want to work in. So it's here it's telling us, hey, check dates in the reconcile settings. So we're going to click on this link right here. And for this first register, I'm going to key in the month of January for my starting date. So January 1 as the start date and January 31 for the end date. After doing so, it's immediately telling me how many dollars, what the amount of withdrawals that were found, the amount of deposits found. It did not find any checks. Now, just for sake of example, I'm actually going to go back to the checking account here, and I'm going to change one of these to pretend that I had written a check. And so I'm just going to go ahead and put in a check number there. I don't have to make this change to the transaction type, but I'll just go ahead and do so anyway. And when I come back to this reconcile sheet, notice that it has now indicated that, yes, it did find $85 worth of checks in this date range. And now one of the reasons that I also wanted to call that out is that I've noticed certain banks can vary on whether or not they will include the dollar amount of checks and the total withdrawals found on the statement. In fact, some bank statements don't even give you a grand total of how many checks or withdrawals or deposits. Capital One, for example, is one of those that doesn't even give you those summaries. But nonetheless, certain banks, Wells Fargo is an example, when they report the total amount of withdrawals for your bank statement, they're actually including the check amounts as well. So that's why there's an option here to say, should you include the check amounts in withdrawals? Notice, for example, right now it's saying over $1,000.36, and if I say yes, go ahead and also include the check amounts. That 85 is now also included in withdrawals found. So again, that can be helpful just depending on how your bank does its bank statement. So, one item you might do is just, again, if your bank statement reports that, okay, there was $85 worth of checks for the month, there was this amount of withdrawals, this amount of deposits, you could probably just call it a day and feel good. But, if you'd like to just make sure that every entry is exact, you can certainly go back to your particular checking account and then start to look from your statement and compare every transaction. So here, for example, we've got a deposit of $13.75. So if I look at my bank statement and I double check my date, double check that amount, I can mark that as being reconciled. And as I do reconcile or mark off these items, you'll notice that it's starts to clear those things away. So as I put an R in for there, it's reducing my withdrawals and checks not cleared. All right, and so there we have finished going through and reconciling all of the transactions versus our bank statement, and we're now at 0 and 0. Now, one other option related to reconciliation, again, if your bank statement lists the total amount, dollar amount of checks, total amount of withdrawals, and you'd like to go ahead and enter that in on the screen, you can also do that. So, for example, if my bank statement says that there was this amount of withdrawals, this amount of deposits and credits, then this system will also let you know that, hey, all the totals match, everything looks good. But one of the things that maybe happens is that, let's say, for example, my bank statement says that the deposits were $16.20. Well, now I do have a discrepancy as to what's actually been found in the spreadsheet, and so I just need to go back and review my bank statement because probably I forgot about $100 worth of deposits that should be in there. Okay, and then when you're done with your monthly bank reconciliation, I just recommend that you blank out these entries, being careful not to delete any of these because these are fairly complex formulas. All right, so I hope this walkthrough has been helpful. Please note that there are other videos on my video and resources page that can help with a variety of things. There's also a frequently asked questions, and in the case of reconciliation, I have an article that is specific to common problems that individuals sometimes run into as they're reconciling their bank accounts. So you'll also see that handy article when needed. Well, thank you for watching. Please consider liking and subscribing, and I hope you excel in your finances.